So being somebody who has organised many conferences and seminars and so on for over the years, one of the things that I know is that it's always a good practice to put the most boring speakers on after lunch. Because then you give everybody that nice opportunity to have a bit of a rest and they can sort of just doze off while the talk's on. So don't worry, I won't feel offended. Okay. That's my karma. If that happens to me, that's my karma. Okay, so we want to continue talking about ethics and to try to explore some more aspects of it. And here on this slide I've got just a kind of a nice summary of what I think is the Buddhist approach to ethics, summarising up many of the things Ajahn Brahmali was talking earlier. If the intention is good, then happiness results. If happiness results, the intention was good. And the important part about it is we can know what happiness is and we can know what good intentions are. Of course, we can't know these things absolutely. We can't know them all the time. We can't know them with perfect clarity. But at least we've got some idea. Yeah? So we've got some idea of whether a certain action has led to people being more happy or satisfied or content or something. And we can have some idea, was our motivation coming from anger or ill will or from kindness and so on. And when we put those two things together, we can of course then use them to test those things. Yeah? So for example, you might do an action, you think, well, I have this good motivation to do this action, but it ends up with a terrible result and everyone's suffering and so on. So then you think, well, what's going on there? Was it really the case that my motivation was pure? Perhaps I was actually acting out of some hidden motivation I wasn't aware of. So these things can be used to help to check and balance each other. And I think this is one of the great things, I think, about the Buddhist approach to ethics. It's not based on something which is unknowable. Okay? It's not based on the will of God. It's not based on natural law. Right? The idea of human rights. I'm a great supporter of human rights in terms of the practicalities of it, but in terms of the theory of it, what on earth is a human right? I have not the faintest idea. You know, it says we have these rights are every person has these inalienable rights. Yeah, self-evident, isn't it? What it says in the American Constitution or something? These things are self-evident. All men are created equal. Yeah. Okay. And or is it we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal, is that right? But they obviously didn't hold it self-evident that women were created equal. Got there eventually. But, you know, it's interesting how it shows what's self-evident to somebody is far from evident to other people. So human rights, yeah, again, it's great to support human rights, but the theory of it, it's not based on anything which actually is empirical. It's just based on an idea. Whereas the Buddhist approach to ethics is based on that reality that you can experience, the happiness and sadness. You can know that in yourself. You can know it to some degree in others. And you can know your own intentions, and you can know your own the intentions of others to some degree, not completely. So to me, this is one of the great things about Buddhist ethics. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a bit about... Yeah, Danya. Huh. Yep. Yep. Okay, yeah, that's a very good point. So Danny's question was about that if ethics is what leads to happiness, what do we mean by happiness? And of course that's a very good point, and this is again I think one of the great aspects of the Buddha's teachings is that he not only talked about the ethics, but he also gave a very profound and insightful psychology of what happiness actually means. This is something when I've studied Western philosophy, we studied utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a similar idea that what is good is what leads to the greatest happiness for the greatest number. There are different formulations of it, but it's something like that. Of course, once you've defined ethics in terms of happiness in that way, you then have to provide a definition of happiness. And that's something which is proven much harder from a Western perspective to actually define effectively what happiness is. We discussed this in one of my philosophy tutorials, and the tutor was saying, well, if I believe in utilitarianism, am I going to derive more happiness when I go home tonight from reading a book on philosophy or from going out and getting drunk? He says, well, actually I derive a lot more pleasure from going out and getting drunk, but I think that reading a philosophy book's a better thing to do, right? So we have to have some more meaningful understanding of what happiness is. So the Buddha gave quite a detailed analysis of that, and we'll be talking more about that during the course. But for example, we have the kama sukha, the sensual happiness, right? Which is the easiest kind of happiness to get, but the least worthwhile form of happiness. But it's still happiness, right? It's still better than not having it, right? It's better to have a nice meal than to not have a nice meal, but it doesn't matter all that much in the scheme of things. And then you have the happiness, for example, of the Buddha called abhyaseka sukha, which is the blameless happiness that comes from keeping precepts. Right? So this is a more subtle kind of happiness, which may or may not be a kind of feeling. Yeah? You think about that. If you keep your precepts, sometimes you might do a good thing and you actually feel happy. Right? You're in a good mood afterwards. You can say, well, I have a happy feeling. But sometimes it might not actually be a happy feeling. You might not actually be in a good mood, but you still, in a sense, have a sense of contentedness or satisfaction that you've done the right thing, right? Even though you might not describe it as actual happiness. But this is also a more subtle form of sukha, of happiness. And then other forms of happiness, like the happiness of samadhi in meditation, the ultimate happiness of nibbana, and so on. And so that obviously plays into this particular formulation, that when we're thinking about what the happiness is the outcome, then we should be aiming for what is the most profound form of happiness. What's the most subtle form of happiness? And so one of the features of the Buddhist path, if we're practicing it properly, is that happiness grows and develops through the path from relatively ordinary, straightforward forms, and gradually builds on and conditions and becomes deeper and more profound as we keep going. Okay, precepts. Don't kill, don't steal, don't betray your partner. All right, got that? Next. Maybe you should say a few things more on this. Okay, so in these precepts I'm summarising what the Buddha called the dasa kusala kamma pata, right? The 10 skillful ways of action, of karma. And these dasa kusala kamma pata are very similar to other formulations, like the 5 precepts, the 8 precepts, and so on. But they're more framed in terms of ways to live, rather than specific precepts that shouldn't be transgressed. And this is similar to the point Ajahn Brahmali was making earlier about the idea of positive ethics, something to aspire to. And you actually find this mentioned explicitly in the suttas in a few places, where the Buddha says, I didn't have to admonish my monks and tell them do this and do that, but it was enough for me to do it, and then they saw that and they would emulate that example, so they would follow my example. So as long as the Sangha was practicing well, then there wasn't any need to be laying down lots of rules and so on. So these dasa kusala kammapata are more in the sense of principles to follow and to develop through your life, rather than necessarily precepts as such. And when we see how they're described in the sutta, so I'll just come over to have a look at the sutta itself. It should be here. No, it's not there. Where is it? Yes, there we go. Okay, I see something different on my screen here, so I'm not sure. Okay, so the Saleka Sutta has the Dasakusala Kammapata. So the Saleka Sutta Majjhima Nikaya was one of your readings. I won't go through the whole sutta, but just notice here we have the parallels for the Saleka Sutta. one parallel in Chinese, another second parallel in the Chinese Samyukta Agama, and the Vairāñjika Sutta in the Pali. Next Pali Sutta also is very similar. So in the Saleyaka Sutta, so you have to excuse me, I have to turn my head because again I can't see the what's on the screen in front of me. The Buddha speaking to the householders of Sala, the Brahmin householders of Sala, and they asked a question of why do some beings go to heaven and some beings go to hell. Now, an important point to make here is that even though the idea of rebirth and good destinies and bad destinies and so on is very basic in the early Buddhist texts, but the Buddha did not hang his ethics off a belief in rebirth. Okay, there are many reasons for doing good and refraining from doing bad. Okay, some of which pertain to future lives, but many of which don't. Many of which you can see for yourself in this very life. So in this question, it's not the Buddha who's saying you should keep these ways of action because it will lead to a good rebirth or bad rebirth. He's saying he's responding to the questions of the Brahmin householders. And his answer is that when they live conduct in accordance with Dhamma. Now, this might seem a bit obscure, like what is the point that the Buddha is making here, but put yourself into the Brahmins' points of view. Their point of view is that you go to heaven by practicing the Vedic rituals. Okay, and you go to hell if you don't practice the rituals properly. Right? That is what the word karma meant before the Buddha came along and redefined it. Okay, karma is the rituals that you perform. So the Buddha is making a radical shift here by saying karma is what is your intention, what is your behaviour. And then goes and outlines the kinds of behaviour, 3 kinds of bodily conduct, 3 kinds of verbal conduct, 3 kinds of mental conduct. And I'll just skip over the sort of the negative side and just go straight on to the positive side. 3 kinds of bodily conduct. Someone abandoning the killing of living beings become ones who abstains from killing living beings. With rod and weapon laid aside, gentle and kindly, he abides compassionate to all living beings. So again, you can see so formulated so clearly here this idea of a positive ethic. Okay, it's not merely I'm not going to kill, but I'm going to live compassionately for all sentient beings. Isn't that a wonderful thing? That's not just a precept to keep, but that's something to aspire to in our life. You know, it's curious that it's become so ingrained in the Buddhist tradition that, you know, the precept is I'm going to refrain from this, I'm going to refrain from that, I'm going to refrain from that. In modern times, you have someone like, say, Thich Nhat Hanh, the famous Vietnamese teacher, who's developed his own set of precepts where he's sort of phrased the precepts in a positive way, right? Which, terrific, but it's already there, right? You don't actually have to reinvent that. That's actually what the suttas say. And they actually phrase it in this positive way much more often than they do just in the bare way of I'm going to refrain from this. This is the normal way that precepts are presented right throughout the suttas. Okay, so similarly, abandoning taking what is not given. Abandoning sexual misconduct, of course, is an interesting definition here. He becomes one who doesn't abstains from sexual misconduct, doesn't have intercourse with such women as are protected by mother, father, brother, sister, relatives, as have a husband, as entail a penalty, and those which are garlanded in token of betrothal. So the first thing that we can infer from this is that it's fine for women to have commit adultery with anybody who they like, because that doesn't come under this rule. Okay? It's just what it says. Don't blame me. Okay, so what it's talking about this idea of protection. So again, it's not talking about doing anything in particular, right? Ajahn Brahmali was talking about S&M earlier, and then we have arguments about homosexuality and all of these kinds of things. None of that has anything to do with Buddhist sexual ethics. What Buddhist sexual ethics is to do is to not betraying somebody. And in this case, what's mentioned is that in Indian society then, during her life, then a woman would be considered to be often under the protection of somebody else. Obviously, in the case of children, that's still very much the case today. And in many cases, if they're either children or they're married, and there's some kind of arrangement like that, then it would be a similar situation today. One interesting point to notice there in terms of social history, if you look at the later Hindu Dharma Shastras, the Manusmriti and other Dharma Shastras, they always say that a woman must be under the protection of a man for her whole life. As a daughter, as a girl, she's under the protection of her father. As an adult, she's under protection of her husband, and in her old age, she's under protection of her sons. Whereas here, actually, she can be under protection of her mother or her sisters. Right? So there's no idea that a woman has to be under the protection of a man at all times. So some woman who's in some kind of situation, or someone who's in some kind of situation where they're under guardianship, as entail a penalty, would obviously mean something like underage or something like that, or those who are engaged to be married also. So the idea is that one isn't breaking some vow or some law or something like that. So I think we can all see that causes a lot of harm, right? And causes a lot of suffering. Okay, so similarly, when we come on to the speech, we can see that there's very positive presentation of speech. Interesting that the precept on wrong speech is defined specifically as wrong speech in a legal context, right? Which is obviously a very strong context of wrong speech, right? It's considered to be not just bad but illegal to lie when you're in the courthouse. With malicious speech, he said it doesn't using malicious speech, but one does not repeat elsewhere what is heard here for the purpose of causing division from these, nor does one repeat to these of what is heard elsewhere for the purpose of causing division from those. He is a reuniter of the divided, a promoter of friendships, enjoying concord, rejoicing in concord, delighting in concord. He becomes a speaker of words that promote concord. Okay, so this is actively using speech in a way that's going to be meaningful and useful. Very important to remember, something you see often disregarded in the Buddhist world. Buddhists often seem to think that not saying anything is always okay, right? Well, you can always get out of a problem by not saying anything, and being silent is always a valid choice. Well, it's not. It shouldn't be. Yeah? And I think this is often too much the case in Buddhism. And we've even been told that by people in Australian society. I remember hearing a talk by Professor Jeff Gallup. Many of you would know him. He was ex-Premier of WA and quite well known. He was one of the patrons of Jhana Grove and so on. And he gave a talk to the Sangha once in Canberra, and the theme of his talk to the Sangha was how the Buddhists in Australia need to speak more. Right? And people and politicians and people who are running Australia want to know what the Buddhist community thinks and how we feel about things and what our opinions on different issues are. But they don't know, and they can't find out. Who do they ask? Yeah? Who speaks for Buddhism, for Buddhists and Buddhist values in Australia? So I think this is something that's important to know. And remember this in your workplace, yeah, in your family, at your school. Yeah, when the opportunity comes to speak out about some Buddhist values, take that opportunity. Don't be shy. Buddhist values are wonderful. Yeah. You don't have to be backwards about it. You don't have to push it down people's throats, right? But when the opportunity comes to speak up and to be confident that we have something to contribute in those environments. Okay. And then the next one also is very good. Abandoning harsh speech, right? Abstains from harsh speech. Speak such words as innocent. I'm not sure if innocent's the right word. What's the word innocent? I can't remember. Innocent. Pleasing to the ear, kanna sukha, and lovable, as go to the heart, are civil, desired of many and dear to many. Okay, so this also is something to aspire to, isn't it? Right? It's not just not gossiping or not saying nasty things, but how can we use our speech in a way that's going to create the most positive emotional environment? Not just conveying accurate information, but creating a positive environment where people feel respected, people feel cared for, people feel listened to. Okay. Abandoning gossip. I don't like the word gossip here. I don't think that's an accurate translation. I would say meaningless speech, something like that. What do you think, Ajahn Brahmali? Yeah, meaningless speech or silly stuff. Sorry? Idle chatter. He becomes one who abstains from meaningless speech or idle chatter. He speaks what is seasonable, isn't a great translation. It just means what is at the right time. Okay, what is at the right time? What is factual? What is good? What's a dhamma and what's a vinaya? He speaks at the right time. Speech worth remembering, which is reasoned, definite, and connected with the good. Again, this idea that our speech should be meaningful and articulate. This also is something that's very important to remember when we're developing this factor of right speech. How articulate is our speech? Are we framing our ideas in a manner that is comprehensible for the person who's listening? Right? This is something which is part of compassion. The person we're talking to, we have to assume, wants to understand us. Yeah? And so it's up to us to make the effort to phrase what we're saying in a way that they can understand. Not saying too many words, not saying too little, and phrasing it in a way that's clear and well articulated.
The word for definite there is pariyantavating, having a limit.
Pariyantavating.
I mean, there's not talking forever.
Pariyantavating. Okay, yeah, pariyantavating. Having a limit, not talking for too long. Okay, excellent. Speaking of which, we should have a break sometime soon. And yeah, just the thing about gossip. People often get kind of paranoid about gossip, but interesting that recent sociological studies have shown that gossip actually has a lot of very constructive functions within a society, right? And because it's how you learn about things, right? So there's nothing inherently wrong with gossip, right? Gossip just means two people talking about somebody else. But how are you talking about them? Are you talking about them in a kind way, a compassionate way, and so on? And so this again is something where we need to reflect on our motivations, and also, you can see that line of wholesome and unwholesome. One way of noticing the difference, if you're talking about somebody, right? Imagine you see somebody doing something, later on you talk with somebody else about it, and then you see that person again, right? When you see that person again, are you happy to see them? Do you feel better to meet them this time? Do you feel like you understand them better than you did before? Or do you sort of feel distant from them, right? Do you feel that sense of disconnection, yeah? So if you're speaking very negatively about someone, then you're creating that sense of disconnection, and you'll feel that. Yeah. Okay, let's sit for meditation for 10 minutes. Ayapasada was asking about the principle that Ajahn Brahmali mentioned just before the break, that sometimes if we apply the underlying principles of the rules, and the rules are derived from underlying principles. Things like harmlessness and so on, and so the rules themselves are just generalizations. So in some cases we might make excuses for breaking the rules, and then how does that apply, especially in the case of monastic conduct, for example. One of the basic rules of monastic conduct is to be celibate, and if we break that rule then we're no longer ordained. But then somebody might come along and say, well, out of compassion, I'm going to go and have sex because, it will make her feel very happy. So so how do we account for such cases, Ajahn Brahmali?
That's really unfair.
Unfair? Come on, it was your thing. Well, I mean, this is a kind of slippery slope argument, isn't it? Right, where once you start, this is where people get a bit nervous when you start to let go of the rules, right? And you think, oh, well, what can happen? And so, of course, yes, that principle can be misapplied, just like anything else can. In the case, for example, of the vinaya, in certain cases like parajika and so on, then your intention is irrelevant. In many cases, as long as it's voluntary, right? So, I shouldn't say your intention is irrelevant, but your motivation is irrelevant, right? If your intention is still to have sexual intercourse, then whether you do it from compassion or whatever is still irrelevant, and you still fall into that offence. One thing which has really helped me in that regard was some studies which was done on developmental ethics, and this was something which was talked about by Carol Gilligan, the developmental psychologist, and this is based on research work that was done in the 70s. And what they did was that they asked a group of women whether they thought abortion was right or wrong. Right? Now, abortion is not the issue. The issue is how people respond to ethical questions. Okay. And this just happened to be the example that they used. And what they found was that, and this is grossly simplifying something which was a much more subtle study, but the very crude terms, when they asked them, they found that they could group their answers in three kinds of answers. Okay, one kind of answer would be basically, well, I'm going to do what I like and stuff you, right? So this is a kind of what they classified as pre-conventional. It's based on essentially on the ego. I'm going to do what I like, and that will justify it. Another kind that they said was based on what they call conventional ethics. Well, such and such is right because it's the law, or because God says so, or because it's our tradition, or something like that. Conventional ethics. And the other kind is a post-conventional ethics, which is, well, if a post-conventional response to it would be something like, well, I think that the principle of preserving life is very important, but there may be mitigating circumstances in some case if we consider the welfare of the woman in this context, and so on and so forth. So this is a post-conventional ethics where you can reflect on what's happening, right? And one of the interesting things that they found in that study was that, generally speaking, they did it. It was a longitudinal study. They retested the same group of women over several years, and what they found was that some women, when they first tested them, might be pre-conventional, right? They only cared about themselves and didn't care about ethics, and later on they might adopt a conventional sense of ethics, right? Let's say maybe they might be fundamentalist Christians and say abortion is always wrong, or some people who'd been coming from a conventional point of view later on might come from a post-conventional point of view, right? They might have earlier said this is definitely wrong because God says so. Later on they might say, well, there are some cases where we really have to consider the context and able to reflect on it. So they found there was that development, but there wasn't any backwards development, right? There wasn't any regression the other way around, right? There was nobody who went from a post-conventional backwards to conventional or pre-conventional ethics. Yeah? So this was a very interesting finding, and it did suggest that there's a very real progression in the depth of our understanding of our ethics through life, which obviously happens at different rates for different people. But one of the things that shows also is that these different aspects or different ways of looking at ethics are useful for different people in different contexts. Okay, so for some people, when they're just developing their understanding of morality, then they need to be given rules. So to go from the pre-conventional pre-conventional ethics to conventional ethics, you need to do that, right? So if you're talking to kids, for example, you need to say, don't do this. Don't put your hand on the stove. Right? Don't hit your sister. Yeah? And you don't need to say, well, you should reflect about whether hitting your sister is going to be causing a greater balance of pain over pleasure, and so on and so forth. Right? And so later on, as they mature, they can see more context, right? And so they can gradually learn to grow up. But of course, we do that at different rates, don't we? Right? We don't all do that completely. Generally speaking, as adults, we're able to reflect about ethical issues, but we don't always do it very well. We do it in some places better than others, and so on. Our development isn't perfect. But I think this is a good way to look at it and to think about it. And one of the other points when we understand it in terms of that model is also very useful, is that it's very easy from a conventional point of view. It's very easy to confuse, either deliberately or accidentally, to confuse a pre-conventional and a post-conventional point of view, right? So, for speaking, again, to come back to your example, if you're thinking from a conventional point of view, monastics should keep the vinaya, right? So a post-conventional point of view might be to say, well, there are certain contexts where you can reflect and so on and say, well, there are cases when you don't have to keep the letter of the vinaya because it will actually cause more harm than it's supposed to, and so on. But then that kind of language can easily be co-opted to justify what essentially is just a pre-conventional point of view. I want to get what I want. Right? And so you can use the language to try to justify that. So this is, I think, something which is actually very important. And when I understood and learned about that model, then that really helped me to put these things into place. It isn't necessarily easy to tell when those things are happening, right? But at least if we understand what that process is, we have some basis for being able to assess what's going on in that particular situation. Yeah. Yeah, Eddie.
Yeah. For my part, am I right to say, okay, Buddhist ethics are not commandments?
That's right, yeah.
Being Buddhist, we are free,
We
are free from it. That's the thing, how do I say this thing? We are free. Compared to other religions, you can't do this and that, and we want to be made to be free as Buddhists, okay?
Yeah.
Ethics, if you can see it as like a guideline, for us it's a guideline, for us to gradually improve and improve. You understand?
Yeah, sure.
That's how I see it as a Buddhist. I want to be free.
That's
free from any like a punishment to me. I don't want that.
Okay. I will not punish you, Eddie, no matter how many reasons I have. But that is a very good point, and I think one which we need to emphasize is Buddhism. Buddhist ethics is not based on commandments. It's based on, and there was a phrase in the precepts, is sikkhapadang samadhiyami. I undertake the training. Yeah. So it's always first person. I undertake. Yeah. Not something anybody is imposing on you. And so, of course, that's much more of an adult approach to ethics, I think. It's not based on just being told what to do. Having said which, it's also interesting to see that the Buddha even used that kind of approach when talking to children. And one of the loveliest lessons on ethics is from the suttas, when the Buddha is walking into town and he sees these young boys playing in a pond and they're tormenting the crabs in the pond, pulling them out and pulling the legs off the crabs and stuff. And the Buddha says, what are you doing? And they tell him what he's doing. And they're saying, well, and the Buddha says, Buddha doesn't say to them, don't do it. He doesn't say, you're bad boys, right? He doesn't say, your parents are going to punish you, right? What he says is, well, when you do that, do you think those crabs feel pain? Yes. Well, do you feel pain? Yes. Well, do you think if somebody came along and pulled your arm off, how would you feel about that? Oh, I wouldn't like it very much at all. Well, how do you think these crabs feel when you pull their arms off? Well, now that you mention it, I guess they probably don't feel very good about it. Yeah? So even for little boys, he didn't tell them what to do. He didn't lecture them, but he drew out from them what they already knew, but they hadn't made it conscious. They hadn't integrated it, they hadn't made it part of their lives. But somewhere inside them, they already knew that. And very often I get asked by Buddhist families, they come along and they say to me, I want you to teach Buddhist values to our children. And I always just laugh and say, but your children already know Buddhist values, right? And so I've done that with groups of people before. You sit down and there's a bunch of parents and a bunch of kids, and the parents say, we want you to teach Buddhist values. And so I say to the kids, is killing right or wrong? And they say it's wrong. I say, why is it wrong? Well, because it causes harm and pain. What, is it right to steal or wrong to steal? Well, it's wrong to steal. And they already know these things. Yeah? It doesn't mean that they always live in accordance with it, okay? So again, the point is not to say that a job as an educator is to tell them what is right and what is wrong, but to draw that out of them, to make it conscious, to get people to reflect on it. And again, as we'll see the Buddha did with his son Rahula, we'll see that very shortly. So just briefly, there's at the end of this... sorry, Ajahn Brahmali, you were going to mention something earlier.
Okay. I just wanted to maybe just reply very briefly to what Venerable was saying over there. I don't think, basically I think as a monastic you are committed to a precept. I don't think that's a good idea to sort of start thinking, ways around them or whether there is a good reason, this kind of things. Usually it's quite easy to keep the precept, almost in all situations. And it's very rare that you have to think, to justify breaking them. Maybe there are very occasional cases of minor precepts where you can break, but generally speaking it's not really necessary here. What I think is much more important is actually to understand that even if you keep your precepts 100%, as a monastic, still you can actually get away with really bad things. And one of the classical things that is not covered by the monastic precepts is like torturing somebody. I mentioned that to Ajahn Sudato yesterday, and he said, oh yeah, you can waterboard somebody and there's no problem. Now, does that mean that waterboarding is okay from a moral point of view? It doesn't break the patimokkha seal, it doesn't break the monastic virtue, the rules, but obviously it's still wrong, right? So sometimes too much focus on just rules and forgetting the underlying principles means that you think you can get away with things which actually are immoral, when in fact you're not getting away with that at all. You're doing bad things. Rules is one thing, karma and ethics is something else. So you have to broaden it out. And there's also the other side of that question is, if you just focus 100% on rules all the time, the rules are always about things you shouldn't be doing, you forget the positive side of ethics. Because the positive side of ethics is never really covered by rules. The rules are always about things you shouldn't be doing. So this is the danger of focusing too much on rules, is that you forget kind of the Dhamma in it all. And the point is that the rules come from the Dhamma. The rules are not the basis and the Dhamma comes afterwards. It's all the way around. The Dhamma is primary and then the rules come. So the Dhamma is what should be the main guidance. And then the rules, okay, you keep them, but remember that they are not enough in their own right.
Okay, so we'll just briefly, the Dasakusala Kammapada, as well as talking about ethics in the more narrow sense of behaviour of body, speech and mind, also includes mental behaviour, and these are essentially strong forms of greed, hatred and delusion. So the first one is covetousness, so one does not covet another's chattels and property thus. That what is another's were mine. So also he doesn't have a mind of ill will and wishes that may these beings be free from enmity, affliction, anxiety and live happily and so on. And he also has right view, which essentially is the right view of understanding that good action leads to good results. So again, I won't go too much into that because our main focus is on ethics here, but just to show that the mental aspect, what lies behind the ethical conduct, of course, is ultimately the most important thing, and is what we're here in Buddhism to develop. These kinds of defilements or afflictions of the mind are what drive us to commit an ethical conduct. But it's next week in the section on samadhi that we'll be more talking about the training of the mind to overcome these kinds of unwholesome motivations. Okay. So that's that one. I also wanted to look at some bit more a lovely teaching on right speech, which we find in the Kakachupama Sutta. So again, I'll just come over here and look at this wonderful website called Sutta Central. And here it gives us the parallels for the Kakachupama Sutta. So in this particular case we have the Pali Sutta MN21, the Chinese parallel here in the Madhyama Agama 193, and another Chinese parallel in the Akotara Agama. So or partial parallel. In the Kakachupama Sutta gives some lovely teachings, especially on right speech and the relationship between right speech and loving kindness, and how this kind of speech, as well as creating harmony within society, creates harmony within oneself. So these 5 modes of speech which somebody might use when speaking to you, speech that is timely or untimely, true or false, gentle or harsh, with a good or harmful motive, and with a loving heart or hostility. Isn't that true? Right? When we're reading the suttas, we're looking at what the Buddha taught. Sometimes we can become a bit blasé about how beautiful these teachings are. It's so common, so normal to read something like that in the suttas. There's hundreds of suttas that give messages and teachings like this. But to capture it and to phrase it so perfectly and so well, it's very hard to do. And to do that consistently, no matter what the Buddha is talking about, whatever subject he addresses, he is himself the best example of right speech. He always phrases himself so clearly, and he always keeps all of these criteria, always speaking at the right time, as true or false, gentle or harsh, with good harmful motive, with a loving heart or hostility. And so these are very, very handy list of things to bear in mind, especially if you're in a difficult situation, if somebody criticises you or puts you down or something, then you reflect on these things before replying. Am I speaking now at the right time or in an untimely way? This is one of the main causes of conflict. People kind of blurt things out at the wrong time rather than waiting. Say, okay, we can sit down together and we can discuss it in a reasonable manner. Things just get blurted out in a way that's true or false, gentle or harsh. How do we present something, right? And you notice that when people have conflicts, very often it's not the content which they have conflicts about. Very often it's the manner in which things are presented that people put people off and put people on the wrong side. Okay, so in all of those cases, you should train yourselves thus. Our minds will not be affected by this. We shall not give vent to evil words, but we shall remain full of concern and pity, not really pity, but compassion, with a mind of loving kindness, and we shall not give in to hatred. On the contrary, we shall live projecting thoughts of universal love, metta, to that very person, making him as well as the whole world the object of our thoughts, not really the thoughts in this case, is the citta, or the consciousness of universal love. With a mind that's growing great, exalted and measureless, we shall dwell radiating that mind, void of hostility and ill will. In this way, monks, you should train yourself. And the Buddha then goes on to give a very beautiful series of similes. Suppose, monks, a person were to come to you holding a hoe and a basket, and he were to say, I shall make this great earth to be without earth. And he would strew the earth here and there, spit here and there, and urinate here and there, and he'd say, be without earth, be without earth. What do you think, monks? Would this person make this great earth to be without earth? No, indeed, Venerable Sir. Why not? Because this great earth is deep and without measure. It cannot be made to be without earth. On the contrary, that person would only reap weariness and frustration. Right? In the same way that you should develop that heart of loving kindness, no matter how people are speaking to you, or again, making your mind like the empty space and so on. It's a beautiful simile. Isn't it a wonderful way to think about how to respond to these things? It's not that when somebody speaks words of anger to you, you have to figure out how to cope with it. Right? That's not what the Buddha's talking about. Right? He's not saying these are coping strategies for dealing with a difficult situation. Right? This is a strategy, this is a way that we can learn to be so that these things just completely have no effect on us. If your heart of loving kindness is really well developed, then no matter what someone says to you, the possibility of getting angry doesn't even come. Yeah? It's, okay, just have nothing but love and compassion for them. And so this is something to aspire to. This is where that practice of right speech is something that's showing us and leading us on the way. And this is also a very, very good test for how good your metta is going, right? Because it's very easy to develop love and kindness if you're by yourself and you're not talking to anybody, right? At least relatively easy, yeah. But then how is it going to be tested when you're going to come into difficult situations? This is where you really find out whether your practice has been working properly. Okay, and then this sutta, the Buddha, of course, finishes with the famous simile of the saw. Even if bandits were to savagely sever you limb by limb with a double-handed saw, even then, whoever harbours ill will at heart would be not upholding my teacher. Who's not upholding my teaching, sorry. Right? That's something to aspire to. So, no, not really. No, it's the Pali word is ceto in that case, like a heart of universal love or mind. Yeah. Consciousness, awareness. Chitta, yeah, basically it's the same as chitta. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so it's not just thoughts of love. Okay, speaking of which, let's do some meditation. Okay. To go on and have a look at one of the other readings that was cited, the Ambalattika Rahulavada Sutta. This particular one, Majjhima 61, has quite a large number of parallels. So, in the Chinese translations, Majjhima Agama, a couple of independent suttas, and these two translations here are in some of the Vinayas in Chinese translation. Also have some Sanskrit fragments. So these were from Turfan, as well as a version of this sutta found in the Tibetan Vinaya, the Mulasarasivada Vinaya in Tibetan. And no doubt the reason why this has a relatively large number of parallels is because it's a human interest story, the Buddha and his son. So all these stories, of course, very popular and often became included in the longer versions of the Buddha biography, the life of the Buddha. So this episode would be retold as part of that, hence its inclusion in several different places. Okay, on one occasion the Blessed One was staying in the bamboo grove in the squirrel sanctuary near Rajagaha. Has anyone been to the bamboo grove in Rajagaha? Yes, it's full of gum trees. It should be called the Eucalyptawana. Now at that time the Venerable Rahula was residing in Ambalattika, and I don't even know, where is Ambalattika? Must be a little place in Rajagaha, I guess. Yeah. Oh, that's right, isn't it? Yeah, it's mentioned, I think, in the Brahmajala Sutta. Yeah, between Rajagaha and Nalanda. Okay. Okay, so in the evening, the Blessed One, having risen from meditation, proceeded to the Ambalattika to see Venerable Rahula, who, seeing him coming from afar, got ready a seat and a water for washing the feet. The Blessed One sat down on the seat prepared, and being seated, washed his feet. Then the Venerable Rahula, having saluted the Blessed One, respectfully sat down to one side. Notice that the Buddha washes his own feet. Interesting. Anyway, thereupon the Blessed One, having left a small quantity of water in the vessel, addressed the Venerable Rahula. So he's just sat down, he's washed his feet, and now he's using the foot washing water as a lesson for his son Rahula. Do you see this small quantity of water in the vessel? Yes, Bhante. Similarly, Rahula, insignificant is and this word samanaship, I give my apologies for this. This is Buddhist hybrid English. It's not actual language. What would you say, Ajahn Brahmali? The ascetic life? Asceticism? Even asceticism doesn't really... Yeah, ascetic life, or the spiritual vocation. perhaps might even be the thing, the ascetic vocation. Insignificant is the ascetic vocation of those who are, the spiritual integrity, perhaps even, of those who are not ashamed of uttering deliberate lies. And the Blessed One threw away that small quantity of water addressed to Venerable Rahula. Do you observe that small quantity of water thrown away? Similarly, thrown away is the ascetic life or the spiritual integrity of those who live not ashamed of deliberate lying. And then do you notice this water vessel turned upside down? Overturned indeed is the ascetic life of those who are not ashamed of uttering deliberate lies. Finally, he set the water vessel upright and addressed the Venerable Rahula. Do you see this water vessel empty and void? Similarly, Rahula, empty and void is the ascetic life, the spiritual integrity of those who are not ashamed of deliberate lies. So it's interesting that the Buddha went to see Rahula and then started speaking straight away about this particular topic. Did he have a reason? Right? Had Rahula been a naughty boy? I don't know. It sort of doesn't tell us. But, that kind of lesson, you wouldn't forget it, would you? Yeah? The Buddha's again speaking to a young boy, he's using this example which is going to really drive home the point that he's making in a way that merely just telling him not to lie wouldn't work. Well, not necessarily. Well, so the question is, are white lies okay if they lead to non-conflict? And the answer is no. There's no such thing as a white lie in Buddhism. So there's another place where the Buddha gives a analysis of the different criteria when it's okay to speak. One is you should speak when it's true and useful and pleasing. Okay, then you should say it at the right time. But if it's true and useful, right, but not pleasing, then you can still say it if need be. Yeah? But if it's true, I think if it's true and useless, I don't think that there's an opportunity for saying it. And certainly if it's not true, then you shouldn't say it. Yeah, if it's not beneficial, yeah. Then there's no right time for saying it if it's not true and beneficial. Yeah. Yeah, don't bother. So the thing with white lies is that we think, it's all based on delusion, basically. It's based on this idea that, you can get out of causing yourself a bit of suffering or someone else a bit of suffering, but you end up always causing more problems in the long run, right? Basically, that's what always happens, and it's much better just to be honest. Yeah, this white lies just comes from lack of courage, basically. Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh. Right. Yeah. So again, this is where you have a these edge cases, right, where the general rules are very hard to apply in certain situations. Almost all the time what you find is that there are ways of saying things where you're not actually lying, but where you're not necessarily giving away the truth as well. Yeah? However, obviously, if you're talking to professional interrogators, they're probably used to picking up those kinds of things. So in that case, again, you sort of balance. It's a kind of black and white karma, yeah? That there's a black and white in terms of what the results are. It's not good to lie, even to a Nazi interrogator, but still, if on balance it's going to cause more suffering by lying, then in that case, obviously, the lie is insignificant compared to the amount of suffering that would result from it. Yeah.
I heard quite a good story about that particular point some years ago. I can't remember who told me this story, but one of the famous German Buddhists who was a Buddhist during the Second World War, he was actually hiding a Jew in his house. And the Gestapo actually came to the door and they said, are you hiding, is there anything we need to see in your house and all that? He said, oh no, please come in, please be welcome. There's no problem at all. Come in, just have a look around. And I said, okay, no need, and it's fine. And he closed the door. So sometimes just by being kind of brutally honest like that and being, kind of over the top, and you can actually find a way through that kind of situation. And that's what this Buddhist did. They didn't actually have to lie here. Yeah.
Yeah, so that in that case, the Buddha's talking to King Pasenadi, and his queen had just passed away, and she'd been a very good queen, a very good woman, and was destined for a very good rebirth. But she'd done one bad deed, and so she got born briefly in a lower realm for her bad deed. And the Buddha, according to this commentarial story, the Buddha knew that in a week's time she was going to be released from that bad destiny and would go to heaven. So when the king came, he said, "Oh, where did my wife get reborn?" And the Buddha just sort of led him astray and confused him, which, given that it was King Pasenadi, wasn't all that difficult. And then after a little while, he forgot what he'd come there to ask and went back home. And then he remembered, "Oh, I forgot to ask that question." And then he came back, and the Buddha kept on doing that until after a week was up. And then finally he said, "Oh, yes, she's in heaven now." So, yes. Yep. No. If you genuinely believe that it's the truth, okay, then it's not lying. When you lie, and this is one of the things, actually we'll come on to that a little bit later when we're looking at how the Buddha taught Rahula, that he said, you have to know beforehand that it's that what you're saying is false. Of course, sometimes you speak in good faith, you think that it's right, but actually it turns out later that it's wrong. So in that case, sometimes you have to be big enough to admit it. Yeah, I thought it was right, but it was wrong. Yeah? But that's also a reminder that we should be cautious about what we say to be true. If we don't have good reason to believe it, then maybe we can say, well, I think this is the case, I believe it's the case, it seems it's the case, but unless we're really sure about it, then not to insist that it is the case. Eddie?
All this preset thing, lying, we have to use our wisdom every day to approach in different situations. As long as we don't hurt people's feelings, we don't hurt ourselves, okay? At the end of the day, say if you would know it, if you're a follower, if something wrong, you would know it. Something would tell, that's for me, you would know it, I've done something wrong, and then you correct yourself. You don't have to be a freak, like athlete's freak. What you have used, it's a guideline for you. You follow it, yes, as much as you can. But don't have to blindly, follow that 100%. What do you think? That's what I do. I use my discretion. I use my wisdom to do things. That's why people get that's me, I might be wrong. But then in the books, you say, no, you can't do this, you can't do all these things. That's bullshit to me, sorry. I'm sorry to use the word. That's getting too much like you're a freak. That's why I
Okay, thank you very much for that point of view, Eddie. Yeah. Yes.
It's been on my mind most of the day. What's another word for ethics? Because first I thought conduct, but then I think no, conduct is used. Ethics is probably a higher realm in Western tradition. Ethical conduct means that you're informed of basic human nature, that you're rising above that to something higher, like human rights.
Mm-hmm.
I think ethics, the way I sort of think of ethics, is sort of on a higher realm, higher level of thinking.
Really? Oh, we're definitely aiming lower here. Well, I actually see ethics as the other way around, as being the opposite problem. And yes, it's not an ideal word to use for sila. Obviously, when we use these words, always bear in mind we're translating something from the Indic idiom, which is never going to completely capture it. But in my experience, the way the word ethics is used in contemporary context is actually much more impoverished than what we talk about as sila, and it rarely encompasses that kind of positive aspect of ethics. A few years ago, I sat on the ethics committee for the Royal North Shore Hospital in Sydney, Human Research Ethics Committee. So we had to oversee the sort of ethics submissions for all of there was actually 2 Human Research Ethics Committee in that hospital, but for a whole bunch of human research proposals, medical proposals. So there was anything from like cancer research to sort of behavioural studies and surveys of people and the services they're using at the hospital and all kinds of things. And there was a number of people who were sitting on the committee and evaluating these things. And I did it because I was interested in ethics and I wanted to learn how these things happened. And one of the things that I found was that, it was all very kind of middle class. It was all very kind of, well, is somebody going to be offended by the wording of this phrase in the approval form for the ethics? It wasn't like, is it okay to chop people's hands off and sew them back on again or something like that. But it was all about these kind of basically not offending anybody. That's really what ethics was how can we get by? And that's not to criticise, it's just to acknowledge that it had a very limited aim. The limited aim was to say, well, there are all these people who have an interest in what we're doing, who are potentially harmed by it, and is this going to potentially upset anybody or cause any harm or anything like that? But when it came to actually what I thought were more important ethical issues, then I felt that there wasn't any scope to actually even bring them up. Right? That wasn't part of our remit. For example, one case that came up and made this very clear was there was a proposal for research on a particular cancer cure. And the justification for doing this research was that, so when you're doing it, part of the ethics is you always have to have justification for it, right? So you have to be able to say, well, there's always some harm, so you have to be able to say, well, the benefits will probably outweigh the harm. And in this case, the justification was that a medicine for this kind of cancer had been introduced a few years ago, but now because it had been basically overused, that people were resistant to it and people were rejecting that medicine, and now we had to develop a new one. Right? So to me, that immediately raised the ethical issue of, well, is this an appropriate process to be going down, right? If we're just going to be developing new medicines that are going to become obsolete within a few years, surely that raises that question of, well, where's the balance of benefit and harm over this? But that kind of question we couldn't even raise within that context. So my own perception and experience is that ethics is used, the word ethics is used in modern context in a very minimal sense. What is inoffensive? Right? What can we get by all these different people without anyone getting too upset by it? Yeah.
Using the word ethics today, I haven't heard the word morality. And that's probably has all kinds of baggage too.
Yeah.
With the power word, where does it stand? Can you say whether it stands in relation to ethics and morality?
Oh, well, I don't know. I don't make any particular distinction, but just morals always has this kind of connotation. Well, the connotation is a bunch of kind of dried up old men telling people what they can't do. I mean, this is the kind of idea of has that implication. So I tend to use ethics as a more neutral or secular term, I guess. Yeah. I mean, often they translate sila as virtue, which in a sense is quite good. Conduct also, I think, is quite good. Even behaviour sometimes is quite good. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so the Buddha going on his discussion with Rahula, and again speaking to a young boy. I don't know how old Rahula is at this age, but it's obviously still not really grown up. And of course, kids always love war and stuff, right? So you start to talk to him, give him a simile about a war elephant, and he's going to be really interested in it, right? So Just like a king's elephant with tusks like plough poles, mature, well-bred, whose place is the battlefield, having gone into the strife, performs doughty deeds with his forelegs, hind legs and hind part of his body with his heads, ears, tusks and tail, protecting over the trunk. And the mahout thinks that despite this elephant's prowess and the various feats he's performed, as he's protected his trunk, his life has not really been risked. But then when he goes into battle and risks everything, including his trunk, then think that he's really thrown himself completely into the battle. And so the same thing with uttering deliberate lies. So one shouldn't give deliberate lies, not even for a joke. So there was an Irishman, an Englishman and a Scotsman who went into a bar. Is that a lie? There wasn't really an Irishman, an Englishman, a Scotsman who went to a bar. I just made that up. Does that mean you can't tell jokes? Who's going to volunteer to tell Ajahn Brahm the bad news? So again, this comes back to the question that was asked earlier, whether if you say something that's to be wrong, that later turns out to be wrong, is that a lie? And that's not a lie. But one of the other thing that's being brought up here is that one of the basic ideas of a lie is that you're deliberately creating a false belief in another person, or trying to create a false belief in another person. So in that case, if you're telling a story or telling a joke or something, if you're not intending for them to believe it, then of course this is not lying in that sense. And the kind of lie that it's talking about here, maybe if you're in the monastery and you tell another monk, I just saw your kuti, it was burning down, and that monk runs along panic to see his kuti and it's not burning down, you think, ha ha ha, something like that. You've deliberately created a false belief in his mind. Okay, so that's the kind of thing monks get up to sometimes. Not all that often, I have to admit. Anyway, moving along. Okay, what is the purpose of a mirror? And again, notice how Buddha, when he's talking to Rahula, a young kid, always using these concrete examples: the water dipper, the elephant, the mirror. What's the purpose of the mirror? For reflecting. Similarly, Rahula, having reflected, should body action be done? Having reflected, should verbal action be done? Having reflected, should mental action be done? Whatever you want to do with your body, whatever physical action you do, then you should reflect beforehand. Now, this thing I want to do, would this be conducive to my own harm, the harm of others, the harm of both? Then it's unskillful, entailing suffering and productive of pain. Again, notice this connection between the actions that we choose to do and the outcome of it. What does it lead to? Does it lead to happiness or to suffering? When reflecting, you should realize that bodily action does not lead, it does lead to suffering, then you should on no account perform it. But if you reflect that when it does lead to your own happiness, the happiness of others, then you should do that action. But not only beforehand you should reflect in that way, while you are doing the action, you should also reflect while you're doing it, because of course sometimes you get it wrong. Sometimes you reflect beforehand, should I do this? You think it'll be good, but then while you're doing it, actually things turn out to be quite different. So then you say, if it turns out to be bad, then you desist. You stop doing it. But if you realise while you're doing it that it's working and is creating happiness, then you should keep on doing it and repeat it again and again and again. And similarly, having done the action, then you should review afterwards. Yeah? So when you look back again, because often, of course, we don't really know what the outcome of something has been until afterwards, and we've had time to settle down, look back, and to see what's going on. And then it has this idea of confession. And so this is something which is part of the monastic discipline we do every fortnight as part of the recitation of the monastic code, that we will confess any offences that we have against the Vinaya. And so again, this is a very good example of what Ajahn Brahmali was talking about, the shift from a kind of concern for people's intention and their behaviour to a concern with merely keeping rules. Now these days in most monastic traditions, when they do that, we recite a Pali formula which simply says, and often, depending on which tradition you're in, but often it just says, I've committed all offences, past, present and future, that I have committed or may commit or will commit, that are light or heavy, and no matter what it is and whatever world system it is, and so on and so forth, and it goes on and on about this. And then I confess them all, right? Which of course means you haven't confessed anything, right? Whereas the Patimokkha is very, very clear. When we recite the rules of conduct, it says, if a bhikkhu saramanena bhikkhuna apanena visuddhapekena santiapati avikattabha, if a bhikkhu who remembers that offence should declare it, okay? One who remembers it. If you don't remember it, then there's no need to confess it. Yeah? And so this, I think, is a very, unfortunate aspect of how the tradition has lost sight of the purpose of this act of confession and turned what should be a very powerful method for helping each other and supporting each other in our ethical conduct into something which has become just a ritual. When we do the confession, it's not a matter of confessing and then you get punished for it in almost all cases, except if it's something very serious. When you confess it, the other person hears it, and then they say you should restrain yourself in the future. Okay? It's very, very important. It's not about punishing, it's about acknowledging it, and I will restrain myself in the future. Ayating sangvarisami. Again, quite different. When I grew up in a Catholic tradition, we also had that confession thing, and there's a number of differences. One thing that's different with the Catholic confession is that there's a very unequal relationship. There's the confessor and the confessee, right? There's there's the one who's done the sins, and then they've got the priest who's listening to the sins and has the power to forgive them. In the Buddhist system, you just do it. We do it among ourselves, right? The most senior monk can confess his transgressions to the most junior monk. It doesn't matter how senior or junior you are. You just confess it to anybody because we're all sharing that same code of conduct. So this is one important difference. And the other important difference is there's no notion of punishment. It's just a notion of saying you should restrain yourself in the future. In certain cases, if it's something that's very serious, then there are very minor forms of punishment to be undertaken and discipline. But in almost all cases, it's just an encouragement to do better in the future. Okay. Okay, so then the Buddha finishes off, whatever samanas and brahmins in the past, the present and the future purified their bodily, verbal and mental conduct, they all did so by constantly reflecting on their conduct in this way. So then Venerable Rahula rejoiced in his words. Okay, so it's now 2:05. Let's have another short meditation. Continue just by rounding off some of the points from this afternoon's discussion and today's discussion. So we've had a look at something about the scope of Buddhist ethics, the principles that underlie it, the way the Buddha taught ethics, and some of the major formulations of ethical precepts. And one of the things that we've emphasised at each step of the way is how deeply Buddhist ethics is integrated within the Buddhist path as a whole. Of course, that doesn't mean that you have to be a Buddhist in order to practice Buddhist ethics. For example, I had one friend who, before she knew anything about Buddhism, just came across a little booklet and read the 5 precepts. And she thought, wow, that's really good. That makes a lot of sense. So she just started keeping the 5 precepts. Didn't know anything about Buddhism or anything like that, but just that made so much sense. So you don't have to be a Buddhist to appreciate the ethics, either the principles or the precepts of Buddhist ethics. But the full meaning of the sila, of the ethics, only becomes apparent and is only drawn out when it's seen in the context of the Buddhist path as a whole. Remembering that the very beginnings of the Buddhist path is a response to dukkha, right? Suffering. So we experience suffering. And when we experience suffering, then the Buddha said there's one of either two responses to suffering, either despair or a search. Okay? It's very insightful, isn't it? Yeah, two ways of responding to suffering, despair or a search. How can I find some way of escaping from it? So, of course, that escape can be either skillful ways of escaping from suffering or unskillful ways, right? You can escape from suffering by going down to the pub and drowning your sorrows. That's one way of escaping, right? But then there are skillful ways. A skillful search, what the Buddha said, kusala gavesi, right? A search for what is skillful. And if we want to follow that path of escaping from what is suffering in a skillful way, we hear the Buddha's teaching on dukkha and on the ending of suffering. We have inspiration from that. We want to put that into practice. And the first thing that the Buddha said, the first stage of that path is development of our sila, development of our ethical conduct. And that ethical conduct relates directly to that very cause that we were practicing in the first place, overcoming suffering. As soon as we practice the sila, keep the precepts, we let go of so many different kinds of suffering. Yeah? So many kinds of suffering for ourselves and so many kinds of suffering for others. And we all know what the feeling of remorse feels like, and then worry when you've done something wrong and you feel afraid and you don't feel confident and all of these things. You let go of so much just because of that one thing of keeping the precepts. And so this is from the motivation in the path. Is the keeping the precepts is very directly implementing the first stages of escaping from suffering. But the way that it does that is again fully finds its full meaning within the context of the Four Noble Truths, right? Why is it that we suffer according to the Four Noble Truths? We suffer because of our cravings and attachment. Yayang tanha pona bhavika, right? Those cravings that drive us into future rebirth. So when we keep our precepts, we're curbing those defilements, curbing those attachments, curbing those cravings, at least the forms of those cravings that lead to the most obvious and immediate forms of suffering. So because we're letting go of those forms of craving, we let go of the forms of suffering that those cravings create. But of course that's not the end of it. This is only the beginnings of the path. The precepts themselves will work to overcome specific precepts will help to overcome specific kinds of defilements and afflictions in the mind. For example, through not killing and practicing harmlessness, we help to overcome hatred and ill will. Through not stealing or committing adultery, and we're restraining that greed. You know, what the Buddhists called visama lobha is excessive or unbalanced greed. Yeah? So we haven't completely got rid of all our greed, but at least those forms of greed that are the most harmful we've managed to let go of. Similarly, by not drinking and not lying, we're helping to overcome delusion, which actually raises an interesting point is about drinking, because you notice in the 10 kusala kammapatas, 10 ways of unwholesome action, or wholesome or unwholesome action, doesn't mention drinking there. Interesting, isn't it? Also, even in the gradual training, we didn't have a chance to have a look at that, but in your reading you had the Julahatipadopama Sutta, the small discourse on the elephant's footprint, and there it gives a long, detailed description of ethics for monastics, and even there it doesn't mention that you shouldn't refrain from alcohol. But it is in the Chinese text. According to Venerable Ramali, it's in the Chinese version of that particular one, which just shows the limitations of comparative study. You can't always trust these. So there's a bit of wiggle room there, is there? So maybe alcohol might be... Some ears pricking up in the audience. Ooh. We'll have to discuss that one over a beer. Yeah. course, one of the basic reasons that it gives in the Buddhist tradition for saying that drinking is against the precepts is precisely because it causes you to break all the other precepts. Yeah, and that's something which I mean, it's so obviously borne out by experience, isn't it? Yeah? We know in society the costs of drinking alcohol is so massive. And all of those things, people lie, they commit adultery, violence, brawls in pubs and domestic violence and all of these kinds of terrible things which are exacerbated by drinking alcohol. So, another one which there's an interesting kind of bit of ambiguity in the traditions is the vikala bhojana. You say not to eat in the afternoon. So it's not one of the basic precepts, but one of the monastic rules or the 8 precepts. And it says vikala, not to eat at the wrong time, which is kind of a little bit ambiguous, isn't it? I don't know if in the suttas there does seem to be some implication that it's refraining from eating at night time. I don't know if Ajahn Brahmali has a thought about that. I think in the gradual training it says to refrain from eating at night. So, I don't know. Is there a bit of wiggle? Could we maybe slip in an afternoon tea there for the monastics and that would be all right? Anyway. So I'm not really trying to say these things, but just to say that when we're looking at these things and reflecting on them, then we don't make assumptions about them. We have a look at them for what they are and see what it is that they're really saying. So these overcoming greed, hatred and delusion in the coarse forms of these defilements then is what is setting the stage for next week's discussion on right samadhi, which is of course all about overcoming the more subtle forms of these kinds of defilements. Yeah? So no hatred. These are all parts of the 5 hindrances, which are the basic obstacles to attaining purity and peacefulness of mind. And so if we're struggling with meditation, then one of the things, rather than sort of trying to just force your meditation when it's not really coming together, then one of the most skillful ways to approach that is to come back to your ethics, come back to your sila, see if there's anything that you can improve, any precepts you may be breaking, or even if you're not breaking precepts, is there anything more that you can do? Is there any way you can serve? Is there any way you can give? Is there any way you can help? And by developing your sila in that way, you're creating those wholesome states of mind which are going to be then a foundation for your ethics. For your samadhi, for your meditation. So we'll talk more about the whole aspect of samadhi next week. And of course, even at a more subtle level, at the level of awakening or enlightenment, that these things are overcome at an even more profound level. So again, so the purpose of ethics is that it's not just isolated. And I think, again, this is one problem that we have in Western ethics and Western philosophy. I attended a lecture by Peter Singer, the great philosopher, Australian philosopher, when was it, last year? And he's a utilitarian philosopher, so he also has this idea of the connection between what is right and happiness. But it was interesting when the kind of discussion veered on into more topics about who is happy and what does happiness mean and so on, that he sort of became a bit uncomfortable or didn't really answer the question, I didn't think, all that satisfactorily. And I had that kind of feeling that, like, as someone who's working in an academic environment, that he's in the philosophy department and he can't kind of sneak over into the psychology department and be kind of answering questions which is somebody else's domain. But of course, humanity doesn't fit into departments, right? So again, from a Buddhist point of view, yes, you can to a certain degree look at it as an independent subject of Buddhist ethics, but to really understand it, we have to integrate it with the Buddhist path as a whole. Okay, so we're nearly at 2:30, so nearly time to break for, I think, afternoon tea. But I just want to, before we break, see if anybody has any questions. Yeah, Ainsley.
You related ethics to the 5 precepts.
Ethics and the Eightfold Path. Okay, so the question was, we've related ethics to the 5 precepts. What about ethics in the context of the Eightfold Path? Okay, well, the Eightfold Path, of course, starts with right view and right intention. Okay, so we've talked a lot about how intention is the foundation of ethical conduct, right? So the intention of renunciation, letting go, goodwill, loving kindness, and so on. And this is laying the foundations for what are we going to do based on those motivations. And then the next 3 factors in the Noble Eightfold Path is right speech, right action, and right livelihood. Yeah? So, of course, right speech and right action being exactly the same as what we've discussed here. The one which we haven't talked about is right livelihood. And that's one which in the suttas we find is spoken about in quite a lot of detail for monastics, but only fairly briefly for lay people. And for lay people it says the 5 kinds of wrong livelihood is trade in meat, trade in human beings, trade in weapons, trade in poisons, and trade in live animals. Intoxicants. Isn't that 6 then? Or was it monks of Vanija?
I think humans are living beings.
Oh, is it in what 2? Is it Satta Vanija? That's just Satta Vanija. Okay. So it's trade in meat, living beings, intoxicants, poisons, and weapons. Okay, 5 kinds of wrong livelihood. What about working in advertising? Fishing. Well, any kind of livelihood which involves breaking the precepts would also be considered a kind of wrong livelihood. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Gambling. We are running a casino. Is that wrong livelihood? Causes a lot of harm. Yeah. Yes. Oh, okay, so that's one of these kind of borderline areas. If you could say, well, if you're selling meat, say if you're running a butcher's shop, then that would be clearly wrong livelihood. Whereas if you're, say, stocking shelves in a supermarket, and one of the things you stock is cans of corned beef or something like that, is that also wrong livelihood? Well, you could try doing a protest. You could tell the bosses, I'm only going to stock the peas and the beans, and somebody else can put the corned beef up there. But I mean, that comes to another aspect of what right livelihood, which is, I think, important to consider. Is that, again, this idea of positive ethics. So not just what can I get out of doing wrong livelihood, but rather what livelihood that can I do that's going to be of the most benefit, right? So, and I think that's where not just avoiding wrong livelihood, but thinking what's the best livelihood I can possibly have, right? And so I think that's actually a really powerful part of practice. And you see a lot of people really do that, and they want to live in a life, where they're say, working in one of the caring professions or as an educator, and these kinds of jobs, which are actually very helpful. And I think also, other kinds of jobs which we also shouldn't take for granted are just like trades. Being a plumber, I think, is a very good livelihood, right? How would you all feel when your toilets don't work, right? There's a lot of suffering, yeah? So being a plumber is right livelihood. Being an electrician, all of these kinds of things where you're really helping people, I think, is definitely right livelihood. I think where you come to more questionable ones is things where, for example, advertising or sales and these kinds of things, where I was speaking to someone the other day who works in insurance, and he said, that they'd just been to a workshop and they've been told basically the whole day, they've been drummed into them, make people afraid. That's the message. Spread fear. And that's how they're supposed to sell insurance. Yeah. So these kinds of things I have to think are pretty borderline. Obviously, nothing wrong with insurance as such, but that's sort of crossing a line to, I think, to something which is quite unwholesome. Yeah. 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 Hmm. Right. I'm not sure. Yeah, okay, so the question was, can we interpret the context of reflecting while you're saying something with the idea of that, let's say you're protecting someone from Nazi interrogators. I'm not quite sure what it is that you're getting at there. Hmm. Yeah, yeah. That's. Oh, sorry. Yes, I understand your point now. Yes, I think that's very true. You in that kind of situation, let's say you're being coerced to reveal some information, and you lie about it. You know at that time what it is that you're doing. You know that you're saying a lie, and you know that the purpose of the lie is simply to protect somebody. And yeah, so I think that's again that. When you reflect on it, you then know what is the reason for why you're doing it. So it doesn't just become a habit. Yeah. So it becomes something which is meaningful. Yeah. Definitely. Okay. Yeah. Is acting as a profession a problem? Are there any actors in the audience? Well, what do you think?
It comes as a, sort of an astonishment to me, because you would just say it was the outcome of acting as a profession for a long time. And recently, I think I read it many years ago, and recently I heard from my mom indirectly said, yeah, that's for Buddhism. But I do know that if the ascetic was practice the dark ascetic for a long, long time, it would help. So there's some sort of logic to that.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. Yeah, there is one statement in one place in the suttas where it says something like I'm not sure being an actor or performer, but what exactly it means by being an actor or performer will lead to hell. So, but I'm not sure exactly what it means in that context and what kind of performance we're talking about. Yeah. So yeah, there are different kinds of performances. Yeah. Again, it would come back to the same kind of considerations. What's your intention? What kind of thing are you trying to do, and so on and so forth. Yeah. I mean, people learn a lot from actors. From films and TV and stuff like that. I mean, they often have some kind of underlying. They teach you about humanity and different kinds of people in different places and how people react and so on and so forth. So, personally, I don't think that they're inherently unwholesome, but I think that they obviously can be used for unwholesome purposes. Yeah.
Just to go back to the beginning of the human rights theory as it comes from the American Declaration of Independence, I think we danced around the words after all created equal and are endowed by their Creator. Certain inalienable rights.
Okay.
That life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness.
Okay. Yeah.
Which I have been chewing over since I was a little boy, and still don't tend to understand primarily coming from that. I think the inalienable is important for that. And it's always been important to me. What people talk about access to the internet as the human right these days. That comes from someplace else.
Right.
Not theory of human rights. I think a lot of it comes from the French Revolution and from Marxism too. The idea of human rights. And probably lots of other places too. But the word inalienable as an American has always been important to me. And it reminded me, what I want to say, it reminded me of the earlier suttas we read about the stag. At the end of the sutta, he was free beyond what this encounters and he can go where he wants. That's sort of what that image, when I read that, spoke to me. That's what I'd like to have. That's an inalienable right. When I go to the woods and I walk, and I have my cell phone, and I drop off with a heart attack, and no one will know I'm a happy man. Like that stag.
Sadhu. Well, I think the idea that you have an inalienable right to the internet is an interesting one. One might argue that. I think you might argue that we have an inalienable right to be able to turn off the internet from time to time. I think that's probably a more useful one. But I think the point with that is that does raise an interesting issue with the whole notion of human rights, because they are felt that they is something universal, right? Now, the whole idea, the reason why using the internet becomes a human rights issue is because it is then an equality issue. If some people have that access to it, they have access to the education and communication and so on, and other people don't. So it does actually tap into important human rights issues, but of course is very much conditioned by history and time and place and context. And so this is, I think, one of the problems with the whole notion of human rights as a language for framing ethical problems, that it has this aspiration to be universal, but in fact is very contextual. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Another big one which we hear every week is sport.
Uh-huh.
Ethics or not ethics of sport.
Uh-huh.
Every week we hear terrible things, don't we?
I do not know. Do you?
Well, they bite each other's arms.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
They drink too much and they
Uh-huh.
on the drugs, and yeah, it's very bad in sport today, it seems to be.
Mm-hmm.
And it can cause divisions among people.
Of course it does, yeah. Yeah. And I mean, this is one of the things which is so important about this, is you see that when, no matter what profession that you're doing, that if your ethical conduct isn't up to scratch, then so often you see people who just their careers collapse, their reputation's destroyed, and their future is just a mess. And it happens all the time because people are not keeping ethics. So this is something which is so important, no matter what context that you're in. We should break for a cup of tea in a minute. I'll just tell one very brief story. I had a friend of mine who was a businessman in Malaysia. He went to Bangkok one time to sign a contract. The contract was a $7 million contract. And he went out for the night before with the Bangkok businessman who was signing the deal with. And they went to a nightclub. And when they went to a nightclub, they all ordered a drink. And he said, "Oh, look, I'm sorry, I don't, I'm a Buddhist, I don't drink." And then they all ordered a hooker, right? So everybody has a prostitute. And apparently this is normal kind of business practice. This is how you seal the deal. And I said, what happens if you have, some of the business women there to do the deal? Well, they get a gigolo. Okay, well, it's equal opportunity, right? So, and then he said, "Oh, look, it's okay. I'm happily married. There's no need." And they said to him, "We all have a drink. We all have this hooker. No drink, no hooker, no deal." Right? So it's interesting, the psychology of it, isn't it, right? So they're having the deal because they know they're all as corrupt as each other, right? And they're all part of the gang because they're all in it together. And he was out on the outside. So he just said to them, "Thank you very much, gentlemen. It's been a pleasure doing business with you." And he went back to his hotel. That's it. $7 million, right? So then when we think we're being pressured at work to have a drink, to be, feel like one of the team or something like that, $7 million he just gave away. And the morning time came, there was a knock on the door. And there the businessmen were. They said, "Okay, here you are. Here's the contract. Sign it." Yeah. The interesting psychology of it, yeah? First of all, they wouldn't let him in because he wasn't one of the guys, right? He wasn't one of the gang. Then afterwards, they start to think about it a bit more, and they're thinking, hang on, who is this man? He is never going to cheat us, yeah? He is never going to lie to us. He is never going to promise anything he can't deliver. He is completely uncorruptible. He's the perfect person to do business with. Yeah? So this is why they came back in the next day to do business. So this is why, hang on to those precepts and they'll serve you well in the long term. Okay, so we're going to break for a cup of tea before we do.